And welcome back to this episode of Five Alarm Task Force. And I am honored and very pleased to bring you our guest today, who has been with us before a little over a year ago. And it's Dr. Graham Peaslee. And as we've said in previous podcasts, and if you're following the whole concept of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, Dr. Peaslee had really dedicated himself to testing our gear to find out, is there carcinogenic compounds, whether they're singular and they're carcinogenic or they combine due to heat and moisture, whatever, in our gear. And in the next month or so, we'll also be featuring as a guest Mr. Robert Ballot, an attorney who has filed a asking for a class action lawsuit against this, dating back, and this is what surprised me, Dr. Peaslee, dating back to 1977. That's the year I started in the fire service. So I printed out that top page with the parts per trillion in the blood, and I am taking that to my oncologist to have my blood tested, even though I had a full bone marrow assay done a year and a half ago. This, I think, is different, and I think it warrants me going. So welcome back to the show. It's an honor to have you with us once again.
Thank you, Steve. This is an honor to be here. It's nice to revisit when I could not say everything before, and now I can say, well, it's published, and we get to able to sort of fill in your listeners as to what actually was published and what does that mean. And things are happening very rapidly in the fire services now, which is very good to see. Generally, it's in the right direction. And I think that we can take credit to you and your listeners for, having actually listened and said, why do we need this material to be so fluorinated? And the answer is, in my belief, that these materials don't need to be heavily fluorinated. There are alternatives that will keep the firefighters dry. And that's the primary purpose of these things, these chemicals being in the turnout gear. So let me, if you'll allow me, I'll just summarize for a couple of minutes what our findings were. And it may be a rerun of what you heard earlier, but it's to the extent that we can say everything now. Our charge was to see, did all gear have fluorinated compounds in it, and does it come off? The third one is, does it get into the firefighter? And that's still an ongoing study, and we're trying to do dermal absorption studies right now to demonstrate that. But we already know that every piece of gear we looked at is fluorinated. And you can sort of shake your head and say, well, I knew that. It meets NFPA standards, and if NFPA standards say it's got to be this much durable water resistance, everybody put the best stuff they had in it. And that's where the PFAS were used. They were used to keep the gear dry because you don't want to add water weight to the gear. And then secondly, does it come off? And we kind of knew even when we last spoke that that's what we were going to see. And oh yeah, it comes off. And it comes off in many different ways. But there are three sets of garments we looked at, and we didn't excluded hoodies and gloves and belts because those are accessories. We were really looking at the turnout gear, the jackets and the pants. And we found that all the manufacturers, we tested several different types, a dozen different manufacturer brands, not quite, but at least 6. And we found that they were all manufactured the same way. They all met NFPA 1971, and they all use the same textile mills. So yeah, it's all been fluorinated. There's an outer shell, which is fluorinated with a side chain fluoropolymer, typically, and that's what gives its durable water resistance. And then there's an inner layer, which is a moisture barrier. And that's usually a Teflon layer because it's required to be effectively. And both of those are fluoropolymers. Both of those are a type of PFAS. And in the old days, the moisture barrier, for example, were made in a bath full of PFOA, and some of it came along for the ride. Since 2012, well, by the time you got the year 2014, they stopped using that. And we did observe that the PFOA went down in the moisture barriers after 2014. But there's still a lot of guys wearing the old gear or have worn the old gear. Not calling you old Steve or anything like that, but just that there were anybody alive before 2014? Yep. And in fact, like, good part of that gear is still in service, right? It takes 10 years to phase out in general.
Sure.
So we do have
that's for the fire companies that can afford to change it after 10 years. We know.
And we won't even talk about where it goes when you get rid of your fire gear. Does it go to the fire academies where the young guys get it again, or does it go to Mexico? Exactly. All of which I'm not sure I want to do. But then you have the moisture barrier that had P4 in it. It's now swapped to not P4, but they've put in let me put this delicately, a lot more PFBS, which is a C4. And so it's floated in a different a polymer, a solvent than the original one. And they did get rid of PFOA, which is true, but it's now got 100 times to 1,000 times more of the short chain material. And everybody will tell you, the argument is that, well, that's perfectly safe. It comes out of your body in 3 weeks. Whereas you know that the PFOA takes 3.7 years, or 4 years for PFHXAS and 3 or 2.8 for PFOA. So it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years of half-life in the bloodstream. So if you were exposed to AFFF that had PFOS in it, you would have 3.8 years till that dosage went away. My argument is that because it spends only weeks in the body, which it's true, it does spend a lot less time in the body, it's excreted much more quickly. So if you get exposed to this, it will go away more quickly. But what if it's not an AFFF exposure, which is where most of PFAS is assumed to come from? And it may actually be the firefighters, fire services' biggest deal is the PFAS coming from AFFF. That's still a dangerous substance out there, people using the extruders and getting covered with it. That's an exposure risk, and people are now switching away, thanks to the National Defense Authorization Act. The US government is going to switch away from AFFF by 2024, which just is great, because that's a huge stockpile we're getting rid of. But the question is, if you're exposed daily to a small amount coming off of a turnout gear, could that have a different impact on your bloodstream than being a once a year or once every other year type of exposure to an AFFF event where you were covered in? And the answer may be that it's not zero. There's a risk, and we don't know what that risk is. PFBA is perfectly safe, some people say. Other people say, I've never met a fluorochemical that I really want in my body. And that's a precautionary risk. That's a precautionary approach, and say, we've not studied this. We don't know what the mice will do long term. At the sort of chronic dosages, we know that a single dose is not as dangerous. Yeah, but this isn't a single dose. You've been wearing this gear for every day for a long time. And so that's the issue I have with the moisture barrier. The outer layer is a different type of error, and that's where it still has PFOA. Not that it's made with it, and so they can very cleverly say they never made it with PFOA. It's been made with a long chain fluoropolymer, which will then decay over time to release PFOA and other PFAS, the short chains as well, that will all shed off the material. And this is the same sort of principle that Scotch guarding was on carpets. And we knew that in the sunlight that the Scotch guard would wear off. Your waterproofing wore off the carpets, and we talked about that. We thought that the gear might do the same thing. We didn't do an exposure study on the gear. That's more work. We just looked at old gear versus new gear. And we said, what does it look like? And we saw a significant fraction of the fluorine come off. Over 10 years, or longer, we'd see 15, 20% of this stuff come off. And that was a significant fraction of the fluorine on the surface layer. That's not the entire jacket is falling apart. The amount of durable water resistance lost in 10 years is very little, like 3%. But that means the total fluorine has gone down a little bit of the whole jacket. But on the surface layer, we could see pretty dramatic effects, far bigger than that.
Let me ask you, excuse me one second. Let me ask you this question. One of the probably the biggest thing, I think we may have talked about that in our previous meeting, is that this bunker gear, and again, the AFFF, and in my department in North Carolina, we had a lot of AFFF because we were in a community where just outside the airport was part of our fire district, and we had the largest, at that time, the largest finished product gasoline tank farm in the country. And so our chief was very big on flammable liquids. He was an expert on it. He got Colonial Pipeline, a few of the others, to put in subsurface applicators, which was state of the art back in the 70s and early 80s. And then because of his work, we had, many, many 5-gallon pails of AFFF. But we only used it in my 4 years there, I can think of 3 times.
Yep.
And that includes a practice. But our gear, we wore every day almost, for a lot of them were rescue calls, but a lot of them were fire calls. So my question is, even though the rate of the trail off of the P4 on the outer garment, is that amount that it releases affected by heat and moisture and high moisture, high hot moisture content?
Probably not as dramatically as just plain age and sunlight. Sunlight will actually cause the most damage with UV light to the extent that it gets exposed to sunlight, but you need water as well. So, but guess what? You guys do have a lot of water, and you often get wet. And so that means that sunlight and water would be probably the most rapid aging. I'm not an expert on what the high heat will do to the textiles. My guess is that they'll weather pretty well because they're designed that way, but I don't have evidence to say that the more use, the more it came off. So the Metropolitan Fire District gear that we looked at was well used. It was often, it was taken out of service after 10 years because it had holes in it and was starting to look pretty worn. And so those did have more fluorine loss, but I can't tell you that's because it was used in high environments and stuff like that. It would make some sense that it would, but I think that there's just a natural shedding of this from sunlight, even without any use. So the first one we looked at was, in fact, just on a mannequin for 10 years, never used in service. It was a turnout gear. Wow. And they were afraid it had all worn off by then. Oh no, there was plenty left on it. But I don't have enough studies to say that active use, but you can imagine that, like your carpets, the more wear you get, the more it comes off. Sure. What we found surprisingly during the study is that we found hand to garment contact transmission. So the students were, the very first time they got it, they put the coat on to see what it would look like. And everybody wants to be a fireman. My lab's no exception. And then the student very wisely measured his gloves before and after handling it. He says, I can see a difference. I can see fluorine on the gloves. And that was surprising because just by handling the gear, and he was roughly handling the gear out of the box and putting it back in the box or on the shelf and maneuvering the gear around. If he took a fresh pair of gloves, there was no fluorine. If he handled the gear for a minute and then put the glove in, took the glove off and put it in the beam, we could see that there was 20 parts per million fluorine on it, which is measurable. It's easy to see. And so the gloves have none, do this. And we were able to test other textiles and it doesn't come off like that. I mean, it doesn't mean that the coats are shedding. Clearly the coats work for 10 years or more. There's a lot of material there. It's just the atomic layers come off and you see that on your glove, and that presents a risk because nobody I know in the services until COVID hit, nobody was wearing the nitrile gloves, and they except on medical calls. And so we're not telling people that they should handle their gear with gloves. What we're telling them is that, we're washing our hands is a good idea for COVID. Washing our hands when wearing a textile that's treated with toxins is a good idea as well.
I was just going to say that because even on rescue calls and even today, I mean, I watch a lot of the videos and the alarm comes in and everybody goes to, if they hung their gear on the apparatus or it's on a stand, they go with their hands, pull on the bunker pants, then grab the cat. Everything is with the bare hands. Then if they know that they're being dispatched on a rescue call, then they'll put their nitrile gloves on, and that's it. But and when they take the gear off, when the time they get back, those gloves are off, and they handle it again with their bare hands. So they get all this exposure.
Exactly. And so there's a small but consistent exposure to the fabric itself. Don't forget there's also combustion products. So if you're taking the gear off without gloves, then you've got whatever was on there. Or if there was an AFFF event where AFFF was sprayed on the gear, your gear catches most of it. But then that gear we found is really highly fluorinated. It has AFFF residue on it because that stuff never comes out. And so you could get transfer for anything to the hands. And it's just going to be a fact of life. We're going to wash our hands more now that we know that there's not just viruses, but other things that could, combustion products, and unfortunately this PFAS on the gear. So we measured what it was and that it came off and that was present in everything we looked at, and even PFOA was still there because some of the gear is not new enough to have that, and the outside layer was still shedding plenty of it. Not huge amounts. It's some people say, oh, it's only part per billions. What are you worried about? Well, I'm worried about part per billions because if you ingest that will be a source of PFAS in your bloodstream. And it's very hard to make material that doesn't have that as long as you're using it in the manufacturing process. And so the question that the paper asks is not that this is alarming, and we're very careful to say you should wear your gear because that's what's keeping you safe in a fire. Everybody should wear turnout gear, and don't get me wrong. And I'm not going to try and prescribe policies to whether you should wear gloves or whether you should wear the gear on a non-fire call. Those are all department policies that the departments in different districts will respond differently to. But no matter what, you can keep yourself safer just by precautionary. Use the gear when you need to and handle it with respect when you don't, and keep it separate from your living quarters. You should wash it in the extruders, not at home. You shouldn't keep it in the trunk. You shouldn't let the kids play on it. They shouldn't.
Yeah.
That type of stuff shouldn't be done with turnout gear. And simply because it's a functional occupational material that has got some toxins in it that keep you safe. Don't eat your turnout gear, but that doesn't need to be said, right? And so what I'm asking is the hard question, and this is the one the manufacturers have to answer, is that why does it need to be so fluorinated? It's there to keep you dry. Couldn't we use some of the other technologies to keep you dry? And there are dozens that will keep you dry. Not as good as this. This is the best. But if it keeps you dry under a full hose spray, isn't silicone good enough, or isn't microfibering good enough, or isn't some of these other things they have good enough? And and for water resistance, there's other materials that will pass NFPA 1971. Oil resistance, a little less so, but it isn't really oil you're trying to keep yourself from. Most situations, your situation, and if you're in a flammable refinery, yeah, you may want to do more oil resistance there. But for most municipal fire departments or the volunteer fires and things like that, they're not going to see oil spraying that to keep the coat dry. It's going to be water. And water resistance can be met by other methods. And sure enough, we've seen the industry, several textile manufacturers, 2 of them now, have claimed that, well, we can make a fluorine-free water reducing that'll keep the outer shell from using any fluorine. And as long as that's available, you have the customer, i.e. the fire services, ask, well, would you like this to be really dry and have toxic chemical, or do you want it to be really dry and not toxic chemical? And that's your choice. And that, I think, is a pretty obvious question. Well, if I don't need it there, then why don't we make it that way? And that's my argument. Nobody likes change, so there will be some resistance. It will cost money, and and the real cost is, what do you do with the 1.2 million times 2 sets of turnout gear that are on the shelf somewhere? Where is that going to go but into our drinking water? Because all of it's going to go in landfill eventually, and all of it will eventually come out of that landfill into our drinking water.
Let me ask you this. Would it be safe for that equipment to be incinerated? Or does that release toxins into the air that could be detrimental to our health?
That's a very good question, Steve. And the answer is that tossing it in the landfill is probably the worst solution, because it will come off. A high temperature incineration will destroy this chemical. And that's what, you get above 800, 900 degrees, and this chemical breaks down to an inorganic form of fluoride, and that's safe. You don't want to breathe it as it comes out the smokestack at 900 degrees, but if it's done in a high temperature incineration. But the US doesn't have many incinerators. Europe does incineration because it's a small land area, right? The US doesn't have some. We have hazardous waste incinerators, and there are some protests around them because maybe when they first start up, they're not at high temperature, and some of the chemicals come out might be bad. The Navy is trying to burn up all its nerve gas, right? And so they also do high temperature incineration, but they do it out on the Marshall Islands somewhere. So there aren't, the locals don't like it much, but nobody else cares. And so I think that same problem exists with incineration in this country. There's a lot of, I don't want it in my backyard, but sure, we should incinerate it. And the answer is that a new modern incinerator with high temperatures will get rid of this, even on textile, no problem. But that there's a cost to get it there. It's now hazardous waste. Just as we have, and I'll extend just for a moment, you mentioned earlier AFFF.
Right.
Not only does your department there have a lot of AFFF, but every municipal fire department in the United States has a store of AFFF somewhere. Right. And it can be, my local emergency management has 450 gallons of it sitting downtown just in case they need it for an emergency, in a shed. And what if we have that every couple miles for every firehouse in the station, 57,000 of them, that's a lot of AFFF sitting around, and that's all got to be gotten rid of as well. And we don't want it to go down the drain or be put out on pallet fires. We want to make sure that it's properly disposed of, but that's now an expense.
How do we dispose of the old style AFFF?
Yeah, and that's where we need some government help, because you need to buy that stuff back so it doesn't get used accidentally. You're going to need to dispose of it Michigan has gone with a lined landfill, a hazardous waste landfill. I know that Oregon has got an incinerator, and the guys at Madison, Wisconsin sent their old tanks out to, they just paid the cost to ship it to Oregon and burn it. And so I think that there's a cost in that. The answer in Wisconsin, they actually passed a legislature to buy back the unused foam because they didn't want it to go into landfill. Every time Wisconsin passed a law this year that says anytime any use of it, Class B foam is a hazmat incident. So that's a lot of paperwork, and the chiefs have effectively stopped using Class B foams in Wisconsin as a result.
We're also trying to, because of the cancer initiative,
yep.
we're trying to educate the fire service that basically you need to treat any fire call, whether it's a wastebasket or a dumpster or an apartment with shag carpeting, as a hazmat call. And that's why we're trying to emphasize the decon on scene.
Yeah.
You know, before you even get back on the gear and go back to the station.
And yeah, let's not lose sight of the fact that combustion products are real carcinogens, and you have to worry about that. And so the fire service is aware of that. They've got the self-contained breathing apparatus. They've got the decon procedures and all that sort of stuff that's well developed. This is just one that's hitting them from the back. Nobody saw this one coming. And I'm not sure it's as dangerous as combustion products. Combustion products strike me as being very dangerous, but it's a risk, and you minimize the risk. Same thing with this. This may or may not be comparable to AFFF. It may be much less. Maybe AFFF use is the primary exposure. But PFAS, you don't want to get exposed to anyway. It knocks down your immune system. That's bad. There are some diseases directly correlated to PFOA. All the rest are still waiting studies, and in 10 or 20 years, I'll give you a longer list of things that we know are exposed that will happen. But why wait? I mean, the firefighters now, we're working for the next generation to be safer.
Exactly.
Why don't we design the gear to be a little safer? Why don't we take the gear we have currently and just treat it with respect? The end of life is a big issue. How do I get rid of the gear? And I don't really want to, you know, if I am paralyzed with fear, I'll never get anything done. I'm not going to worry about end of life at this point. I'd prefer it off the firefighter and in the landfill at this point. We'll deal with landfills as they come, but eventually we'd like to not have the gear so we don't have that issue of end of life.
Well, I think that perhaps with all this information out there now, and it is spreading, thank goodness, more and more people are learning about it, that the Cancer Initiative really was genuine from two sides. We knew from our combustion products, that's what we first aimed for, in learning there. And then came this discovery about the gear. But I think, as you said, you know, change comes slowly. The two things that the fire service detests the most are change and status quo. So, but I think that working together through the NFPA, the IAFC, the IAFF, and the NVFC, I think that we are dedicated enough to protect the lives of our firefighters, and smart enough that we could arrange as an industry a way of having that a process for getting rid of end of life gear properly, getting rid of our AFFF, so that not each 50 of the 57,000 departments have to think, well, what are we going to do alone by ourselves? You know, we're out here in downtown Bumbledoggle, and you know, there are we have 2,800 people in the community, but we got AFFF because we know a rail car comes through here or tankers come through here to bring gasoline to the gas station. So we have to be able to protect it. So I think we can't leave them out on the dock by themselves. I think that as a greater organization, the professionals, the fraternals can come together, because it affects every one of us.
Exactly.
Whether you're seated as an officer on a board, you are still a firefighter.
Absolutely. And you couldn't have said it better, Steve. And this is a community issue, and it doesn't matter whether you're red or blue. This is a great election year, right? PFAS is going to get into you either way, and it's just whether you acknowledge what the sources are and how to minimize them. And we've already got them in all our blood. That's what Rob Bellot will tell you about. And he's taking a very unusual approach of suing on behalf of every North American, which is really quite adventurous. So he's a hero of mine. But I think that the firefighters themselves are the local heroes, and they're not intentionally trying to pollute their environment. They live in their own community, right? They don't want to pollute their own water supplies. So now we understand that AFFF shouldn't go down the drain. And we didn't know that before because somebody told us it was safe as soap, and that's not true. It isn't. It is a toxin. It's just, it does it in a really different way than many other toxins. And so we want to minimize it in our gear. I would love the community to get behind, and it's already happening. And I was really amazed by this. But I'll call out Sean at the Nantucket Fire Department. 25 firefighters, right? Not the largest department in the world. It's on an island, and it's a nice island in the summer.
In the state that we share, Massachusetts.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but nobody's ever heard of it. But I've been there. I've been to Nantucket once, and it's one of those things that they ask the question of, why can't I get gear without this? And the power of that, one person asking was suddenly, now other people are asking, well, if they're getting safe gear, and the company that's making the first batch has pledged not to increase the price for the safe gear because it actually costs less to make, right? There's less fluorochemicals on it.
Sure.
And so they decided to sell at the same price. And I think that other companies will follow suit very quickly. There's already rumors that several of them have, and they're just trying to get this. And it's just
business.
Yeah, and it's market demand. I'm not interested in any of these companies being hurt financially. It's pandemic's worse enough, right? But I want them all to say, look, there was no. The company that sold the chemical told you it was safe. That's their bad.
Right.
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. These guys are selling you the whole ball of wax.
Right.
Don't take what the chemical company tells you is safe until you have some independent evidence of that. This can be made without it. The bunker gear can be made without fluorochemicals, and it will work. The Europeans have already done it. The NFPA can certify that it's dry. We don't have a replacement for Teflon and the moisture barrier yet, but that's still, you got rid of half of it. The moisture barrier is a different type of PFAS, and in the polymer part of it is safe, certainly. But the fact that the polymer comes with all these other little particles inside it is what worries me, and that does come off with time. And so the question is, can we do that without doing it? And I'm told the test that prevents that from being taken out of the NFPA standard at the moment is a xenon lamp test. It's where you test for UV exposure. And Teflon is remarkably resistant to ultraviolet. It doesn't break down easily, whereas most other plastic layers, the polyurethane liners you used to have, broke down on this Teflon lamp. Of course, you're testing the inner liner for UV exposure. You think about that for a moment, you realize, why are we doing this test? Do firefighters glow naturally in the dark? I didn't know that, but I'm in the nuclear business. We do that all the time. But it's the firefighters don't seem to be giving off a lot of UV light. It's an inner liner of your coat. It doesn't see the sunlight. Why are you worried about UV breakdown of this material? It seems to me to be an extraneous rule, but I'm not a textile expert, so maybe there's another reason it's there. But that one lamp test, if it were reevaluated by NFPA, might allow other materials besides Teflon to be used in the moisture barrier. And that would be a thing that I'm not going to call for because I'm no expert. I'm not a textile expert, but I think that the people will start looking at what alternatives there exist and what are the rules and policies made and who made them. And could these be worked around such that there's a way going forward which protects both the firefighter first and foremost, but also the environment afterwards. And I think both of those, for the communities we serve, yeah, we could put the fire out with asbestos too, but we don't. And there's a good reason we don't do that, because A, it's occupationally hazardous, and B, there would be a lifelong result afterwards. And the fire services don't want that. They want to be on the good side of the story, and not the brunt end of I've got a lake polluted because you put a fire out. And those are not the stories you want to read. And so we're learning that with AFFF. I'm just extending it to gear. And if the gear is made that it's waterproof, but not with PFAS, it strikes me that it's a pretty good compromise. I think the departments should make their own decisions about when to wear and not wear, and where they should wash their hands, and all those sorts of details. The local department told me that they respond to calls. If it's not a fire call, they'll respond with the gear in the truck. But they had never cleaned out the bin in the base of the truck. And I was like, oh, there's 3 inches of dust in there. And I said, I can see some rookie being assigned to vacuum that out once a month, because that's probably a good place to get rid of that dust. And there's always hand-to-mouth contamination. Yeah, we try to wash our hands before we eat, but you know that from the combustion product analysis. If you're at a fire scene and you've been on it for 12 hours, you need to eat and rehydrate. But do you wash your hands before you do that every time? You should, but there's practicalities involved. And so we want to minimize what we can do in terms of exposure risk. And that's going to apply for these as well.
We could put that part into, since we're making now such a much bigger effort with rehab on scene, so that after firefighters been in a couple of times, a couple of tanks, we want them out, we want to do their vitals, we want to check them. And they're the ones who usually give them the water and a snack. So what we can do is I think with a little bit of effort, we can ask them to incorporate sanitizer or washing ability before you hand them the water bottle or you hand them the snack. Give them some hand sanitizer.
Yep. And I'm not an expert in exposure, so we should ask people to be what's the easiest you can do with the least inconvenience. And, it's different with COVID and what you have to wash your hands with. It's different with a fire exposure and combustion products, and it's going to be different with PFAS. All three are potential exposures, but if you have it on your hands and you go through normal business without washing it off, I know that's a source of exposure. And I don't know how big it is, and the relative risks we don't know. But that's what NIOSH and company will study. They're very good at this, and they'll commission a 3-year study and do it, and they'll have much stronger evidence as to what fraction of this could be. And I'm hoping that we get one of Rob Balot's outcomes is that we do blood testing for all firefighters. That would be remarkable. Just though it's very expensive and very hard to find people that will do it robustly. We're working on a test to try and speed that up, actually, but at the moment it's $800 a test, and no insurance company is going to pay you that unless there's a medical need. And so if you're not currently sick, how do you screen for it and things like that? So all these same questions we're asking.
That's very interesting, because the oncologist I went to when I had my first scare, which was due to a misread of an MRI that I had done. And I have a medicinal pump implanted in me, and the port is up around T10 on the left side. So my pain management doctor, because I was having more pain, he said, let's do an MRI. We haven't had one in a couple of years. So I did it, and the radiologist reads it, and I read the report the day after. He says, oh, there's an anomaly at T10. You cannot rule out multiple myeloma. I said, what? I said, that's my port. So I sent them the information, my primary and my pain. And they said, no, your port's there. It can't be. But he says, but we got to check it out. We can't just disregard it. So I went through 6 weeks of testing where I didn't meet him. I had already met this oncologist through my late friend, who went to him and asked me to come to most of their appointments because I could kind of translate what the oncologist was saying. And he and I hit it off. So he was the one I turned to when to get this testing done. And he didn't know anything about the Firefighter Cancer Initiative at that time. He didn't realize the exposure. He was under the same belief that I was back all the way in 2014, 15, that the firefighters we were hearing about with cancer had worked the pile after 9/11. And we knew that the exposure was terrible there in breathing and everything else and the combustion stuff. So that's what we thought. But I was dead wrong. I mean, literally dead wrong with that. And so when I told him about it, he asked for more information. Well, it was 2.5 years before I got to see him again, because my hemoglobin was low. So my primary said, you need to go get tested again. So I went to him, and he is full into the Firefighter Cancer Initiative now. That's good. Every source. He's been amazing with it. And he said this, and that's why he said, I want to do. He goes, you know what? You've had all the other tests that show negative, but I really need to do the bone marrow assay to verify. And we're going to do it here. I'm going to do a medical one. I'm going to do the genealogical one because you do have cancer in the family. I said, okay, whatever you need to do. And we did it. It wasn't as bad. And I made a deal with him. I just got him to only give me one of the local agents, because that one doesn't cause any stinging, as opposed to adding the other one in there. So we had a deal, and we did it. And he did it. It was fine. And I went back 2 weeks later, and he said, you're clear, 100% clear. There's nothing. So that was 1.5 years ago. But yet when I heard these results, and I read part of the report and read some of the other stuff that our dear mutual friend Diane Cotter, who was really one of the great spearheads of this entire movement. I mean, she probably, if she was a firefighter, she'd be firefighter of the decade, because her efforts will save so many firefighter lives, hers and all of us who joined that bandwagon. And we had to. There was no way you could say no to her. And I think that hopefully we can get more oncologists themselves involved in this study, I'm going to reach out to my friends down at University of Miami Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer
Yep.
Center, Dr. Martinez and Dr. Schaefer, and find out if there's a way to, do these tests perhaps at, at an easier level that wouldn't cost as much, et cetera, so that insurance would cover, et cetera. But before we take this break, I want to ask one question. You mentioned that when we get the PFAS in us, it's about 3.5 years. Is that what you said? No, or 3.5.
Yeah, it's years. It's the PFAS molecules, the C8s particularly, are 3 to 5 years in your bloodstream on average. So that if you had a AFFF exposure 12 years ago, you've now got 2.5 half-lives gone, which means you're at a quarter or an eighth of what you were originally, but in that range. And so that it circulates in the blood, unlike some other things that stick to the bone or stick to fatty tissue. These are basically bloodborne, which means they're carried to every organ. And the different PFASs are probably carried. We have a study out that shows that different PFASs go to different organs preferentially. So different ones go to the lungs, different one goes to the kidneys, different one goes to the brain. So the idea of replacing C8 with C6, that may really be a regrettable substitution if it no longer goes, doesn't make your liver explode, but the mice are showing much more activity in the brain with this stuff. It's like, that's not what you want to see. And so these are it's a mouse, it doesn't count, but it's one of those things that you worry about, this chemical that goes everywhere in the system. And the answer is that we all have it in our blood from background, just being North Americans, because it was used on Scotchgard, because it's used on Gore-Tex, because it's used on every possible commercial product we can think of, we're getting exposure. The things that the firefighters didn't know is that they're also getting it from their exposure, not just AFFF, but from the gear. And that's the nice part of being able to tell somebody, you guys know how to handle risk. Just this is one more risk, and we're all going to die, but hopefully not soon. And the idea is to minimize risk, and that'll reach that end. And what you guys are doing are talking about policy changes and provisions and stopgaps that'll get you to the stage where you can have safer gear. And I think that that's the mantra we're going to push, and not that you should worry about how it got to where it was, but more what's the step forward. What people don't feel hopeless as long as they see a way out. And as long as I can see this direction changing, then I think this is a pretty good solution. And yeah, we're driving market forces and we're being a pain in the butt to some people, but it's for the betterment of what the fire services need. And I think Diane's a wonderful inspiration that way. She is what I've described as a force of nature. She's not going to get out of the way of anybody. And, more power to her. I wish more people were like that, honestly. And, it brought my attention to something that I didn't know anything about. And so I make a contribution, but it's up to the fire services to decide what to do with it. And I think they're making, wonderful progress. In a short period of time, it's gone from below the radar to, well, we should talk about this and maybe we'll actually do something. And I think that's remarkable in 1 year.
Great. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, folks. When we come back, I have a couple more questions for my guest, Dr. Graham Peaslee, professor at Notre Dame University in Indiana, probably one of the most prestigious schools in the country. And so we have a couple of questions to continue with, and we'll wrap this up. But we'll be right back right after these words. Please stay tuned. And welcome back to this episode of 5-Alarm Task Force with my guest, Dr. Graham Peaslee, Doctor of Nuclear Science at Notre Dame University. And we've been discussing the results of his studies for a couple of years now, that he found an interest through a letter that our mutual friend Diane Cotter sent to him, an email regarding her husband, Paul, a great firefighter from the great city of Worcester in Massachusetts, who shortly after promotion, discovered he had cancer. How did it come so fast and so young? And that started that was the little first snowflake, I guess we can call it. And it became this huge ball, just like in the cartoon that rolls down the hill. And thankfully it brought you in, and it brought in Rob a lot. And so what I want to ask you, Dr. Peaslee, is what brought you to, as a nuclear scientist, to come into the world of the fire service?
Very good. And I'm going to clarify, Steve, that I'm not the one who called Paul a snowflake. I'm going to let you take that credit. So, he's a wonderful man, and he and his wife have done a real service to the fire.
I meant that they were the first snowflake to fell that started the ball rolling down the hill.
Explain that to Paul. That'll be great. Anyway, the answer is it's a long story, but I'll abbreviate. I have a basic I have a degree in chemical physics, and so I was in nuclear chemistry or nuclear physics, depending on which side of the fence you looked at, for many years, and did a lot of basic research onto how the nucleus works and how to study it with accelerators. And I discovered myself at an institution 20 years ago that had a position that was available if I could teach some environmental science. Sure, does it get me a job? Yes. Okay, I'll be happy. I've always wanted to teach environmental science, so I taught a little environmental science. But my research was always basic science and looking at fundamental effects of the nucleus and how radioactivity works and things like this. It's still quite an active field. And after doing that for a decade more, I began to realize that I should do something that's environmental. And I looked for local lakes that I could help clean up and understand why. It's just a feeling that I needed to contribute more to what I was doing, other than just writing textbrochures and articles that go into textbooks. And after several years of that, I met a woman from California who told me about this brominated flame retardant. And the fire services are well aware of that now, because it was changed in just after I started working with her and started studying with my technique how to measure bromine in foams. The state of California changed the law on brominated flame retardants. And that was my first introduction to science affecting policy. It had been suggested years that this stuff shouldn't be used. It was ineffective, and it was endocrine disruptor, awful endocrine disruptor. And yet, and it's what makes the smoke so toxic, or one of the reasons the smoke is so toxic to a firefighter. And so all the good reasons not to use this stuff. And I was happy to join the bandwagon, but it had already happened before I got to it. And so I was interested in this, and shortly thereafter, my work on this, looking at fluorine, became much more successful than even my basic work, because it's nothing new. This fluorine gamma ray had been known for 30 years, but nobody had applied it to PFAS and said, oh, I could look for a common material and look for it. So that was my innovation. I said, oh, here's an old technique, and there's 6 people in the world who've done it, and 5 of them are dead. So it's a pretty easy game. I said, what if we looked for this other, and it worked like a charm. So we worked with Jennifer Field's lab in Oregon State and showed that it worked on textiles, it worked on paper, and we published a couple of papers that were very large in terms of the scientific community read them. And it wasn't my best work. I'd done all this work on the papers that only 6 people read, and suddenly 23,000 people read this one, and I was like, oh, okay, it's just a question of being in the right spot at the right time. And I had a quick technique for looking for fluorine, and that's but my burgeoning environmental interest was awakened, and Notre Dame hired me because of my ability to take physics and turn it into something that's applied. And the reason is that when you do basic science, you have to ask the government for funding, and you have to go back to them every year and ask for more and ask for more. And it's a very small discretionary part of the budget. It's 0.2%. So it's very little that goes into basic science in this country. Everything else is into Social Security, defense, and all the other big categories. But this is a minuscule amount. The National Science Foundation is terribly underfunded, but we got all money from it and was doing that. But to make it clear to the legislatures that you still wanted to fund science, what have you done for us recently? What have you made? Well, there's this thing called the internet. Heard of that? Oh, yeah. Okay, what else have you done? And so having a scientist who can take some of his work and spin it into societal applications was what I was hired for at Notre Dame. And I installed the new accelerator. I got it up and running. We started looking at fluorine everywhere. We also look at lead. We do lead poisoning in South Bend and now Indiana. We're doing a couple other features on flame retardants and toxic metals, antimicrobials. So we're looking at a lot of different areas. And then I get a letter from Diane. And it says, it's a heartfelt letter, a couple of pages long. And even then, from the one email, I realized I don't want to say no to this woman. She's going to run me over. And so I said, sure, I can measure it. And I didn't think anything more of it. And a month later, she'd sent me some materials from her husband's gear, and we ran them just to see what was there. And it was very high in fluorine. And that anytime you get a result that's so different from all of the other materials you look at it and say, wow, is all gear done this way? This is not where I'd put my PFAS. Why is it there? And I didn't know anything about turnout gear other than I've seen firefighters before. And I have a distant cousin who was a fire chief when he was alive in Massachusetts, Hingham. But that was many, many years ago, and I'd met him. But but it's distant. He's a 6th cousin or something. But it's one of those things that I was aware of the fire services and very supportive, but I didn't realize that cancer was as bad as it was. And studying what Diane sent me and then what I found on my own, and then starting to expand the study, saying we want to study it. And so it was a natural combination of my own environmental interests. I was interested firstly in the environment, but now, wait a second, there's an occupational exposure that's hitting in-service people. I don't have to wait till people are dead. Now I can work with somebody who's alive and say, wow, I wonder if we could figure out what's going on here. And, there was some feedback and some resistance, but I'm independent. I don't get funded by any company. I get University of Notre Dame pays me to do my research, and I also get government funding to do. I'm trying to sell this to the Department of Defense to say, here's a screening technique, and they funded me. I've got some DOE funding. I'm studying sports fish in the Great Lakes this month, so we're catching a bunch of fish and looking for PFAS in them. That's because the USGS is now and NOAA are funding some studies to look at do people eating fish get PFAS from our waste? And the answer is yeah, not good. So it's everywhere, and we need this technique that's rapid so we can help there. But so my research continues, but the firefighters have been a big part of taking something that's very scientific and pretty dry into something that, well, it has a result that, boy, people should know about this. And everybody I spoke to didn't know it and said, are you sure that this is really PFAS and it's not some sort of other fluorine? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's PFAS. We tested it and it is. And so, well, it can't be that bad. Not everybody has it. And I said, everybody's got it. So what do we do? And that led me to discuss lots of times. And there are several pioneers, and I'll call out Bobby Holt, and I'll call out some of these other people that actually had the guts to call me and give us a presentation. The manufacturers actually came and asked me, what are you saying and why? And so I chatted with them and told them straight up what the paper's about and why I'm studying it and what I see and what is there. And they gave me some good feedback and said, yeah, well, okay, but it's not bad, right? I said, well, no, I don't think it's so good. And so some of the manufacturers took it to heart, and it wasn't even from me, but they read social media and said, do we have a plan B just in case? And that's how this whole thing got started. And I'm not interested in getting in the middle of lawsuits. I'm not interested in changing rules necessarily. It's a long time, and Europe regulates everything in advance, and it'll take 8 years in Europe to change anything. I think it's a lot quicker if you simply say, hey, I've got an alternative that doesn't have the toxin in it. Wouldn't you like to buy that? And yeah, you know what? I bet you the market forces will work well in this case. It's what you're looking for are people that are standing in the way for no other reason other than, and the only company standing in the way is the one who makes the chemical. That's the one that really is going to lose. Nobody else is going to lose. They're all going to be leading the cause of, oh, this is fluorine free now. Great. I think the more we can make fluorine free in society, the less we'll have of the drinking water issues that we're facing. I don't think that's the fire service's main issue, but it's certainly one of them. A lot of firefighters are not getting it from their gear, are not getting it from AFFF, are not getting it from combustion products. They're getting it from the water they drink, which they may have had a hand in helping put into the water system. Because if you put out a fire with this foam, it's gotten into the water system, and that's the issue.
All right, so that brings up another question then. If it's in the water of a reservoir that the town or city draws its water from,
yep,
puts it through the reverse osmosis, and now they're filtering. And then many people like us have always had, well, since they came out, have always had the additional filter in the fridge. So our drinking water, cooking water is from the fridge, washing water and everything else is from the sink. Do these filters between the ones that the community uses to process their water and the filter in the fridge for those who have it, can that help avoid any of that, or does that fluorine just kind of wiggle like a little eel and swims its way all the way through the filters as well?
It's not actually swimming, but it does go through most filters. The reverse osmosis is different. Reverse osmosis will take it out. But that's a very expensive system, and there's no municipality in the world that uses that as a primary care except for very expensive ones. You'll see, for example, in Michigan, there's a contamination outside Rockford, Michigan, which is the Wolverine Shoe Company that, oops, accidentally lost all its disposal records for 30 years. And they dumped this stuff into, it's tannery waste, but had full of fluorinated chemicals. They made hush puppies, right? Waterproof shoes.
Sure.
And they put it into, they said 3 unlined pits in people's yards that they bought from the farmer. It turned out to be, they've got over 30 sites now that they've dumped this waste in. And it's under, the city grew and the farmers all sold the land. And so now they've got new developments putting down wells into this old farmer's field, which has got PFAS waste. So the highest recorded blood levels in North America are from a woman in Rockford, Michigan. Her husband's already dead, but she's got up above, what is it, 1,300 parts per trillion in her blood or something like that at one point from drinking the water. And the reason I call out drinking water is because the your method of ingestion is, it's direct, and your body is very few things can take fluorine out of water. The humans are one of the best things to do it because your blood supply will actually filter the fluorine better. So that's a little sarcastic response I make sometimes, is that the best thing to do is have people drink it and you won't have it coming out anymore, because it really does go well into humans. It bioaccumulates in small animals, and then we eat small animals, and the larger animals will get it better. So you can get it from food as well. Particularly wheat and grains take this stuff up, leafy vegetables. And so there are examples where people are being poisoned from the food they eat, which came from an AFFF. So is it AFFF? Yeah, it is, but it's coming a strange way. And I'm afraid firefighters are getting exposed that way too, because if they have contamination in the backyard and it gets in the drinking water supply, not only they, but their whole township is now drinking it. And that's a source of concern. I think the gear is secondary to that. The gear probably won't poison everybody, but it could poison the user. We don't know how much hand-to-mouth transfer there is, and we don't know whether it goes through the skin. But I'll say this, before the study is published, all I'll say is that if I had to pick a chemical that I was going to wager on that would get through the skin is a pretty good barrier. It prevents most chemicals from going into the bloodstream, and that's the purpose of skin. But if I had to pick one, would you place a bet on the world's best surfactant we've ever made?
Fluorine.
Well, that would be one idea. I'd place $1 on that. I'm going to bet some of this goes through. The question is how much, and maybe it's not much, but we'll have that study done in another year or 6 months, hopefully. And we should be able to have some quantitative numbers on that. I know that there are 3 other groups actively looking at that because it's been raised several times now. And so I think that we're looking at sources of exposure. We're looking at levels that get in, and that, it can be very distressing. But I think we have phased out C8s in manufacturing in the US, so that's reducing their numbers in our blood. The C6s are going up still, and I think we can phase out non-essential uses. And there are a couple of essential uses that you're not going to be able to phase out, but AFFF isn't one of them, and that's already been shown. Mm-hmm. So now if you're going to send a spaceship to Pluto and back, it's going to need a lubricant that works in space for 30 years. That's going to be a fluorochemical, absolutely. There's a type of retinal eye surgery where you'd want to reattach a torn retina, right, and then to save the eyeball. That they use a perfluorinated compound to dose the eye up, so that has to be just the right consistency. And there's a perfluoro liquid carbon liquid, perfluorocarbon liquids that they use. But and they're terrible PFASs, but if you're going to save eyesight, it's probably a pretty good essential use. There is no other chemical that works that well. Mm. But the scale is different. There's a 55-gallon drum made of this stuff every year. Okay, and that's all there is of this one chemical, and it's used for all the retinal eye surgeries in the world. If you look at PFOA, you've got tanker trucks per day being made of this stuff in China and being distributed, and that material once made will never go away. It's made forever, and you'll see it cycle through the bloodstream. It'll show up in polar bears, it'll show up in North Americans, it'll show up wherever the top predators are, it'll get into their blood because it was made once. So that's the environmental side of this that I think is so important, that we've got to stop making it. And if we reduce the number of places we use it, if you go up Mount Everest, yeah, you can have a waterproof jacket, and maybe it should be the best we've ever made. If you're putting out fire, you just need to stay dry, and silicones will work just fine. If you want to go to the mall, does it need to be fluorinated at all? The best one, my students just discovered this, you'll like this. They're making waterproof swimsuits. Which just boggles my mind. But you can now go from the swimming pool to the bar and not have to have a towel, and you're dry. That sounds like an essential use to me. And if you're going to use fluorochemicals to make that, then we're going to put more of the fluorochemicals. Those swimsuits will go in the waste, and you will eventually drink the waste. And this way, and so a long answer to your question is that the filters will not take it out. Typically, a Brita filter and things like that will not take out, especially the short chain PFAS. It will have some activated charcoal will take out long chain PFAS pretty well, but only for a limited time. And nobody measures it before and after anyway, so it's not a really good filter. The home filters, the ones that are reverse osmosis, will clean the water, and so that's what was delivered in Rockford, Michigan. Of course, it only handles 2 or 3 gallons an hour. The woman I spoke to said, "Yeah, is it going to work?" I said, "Yes. Change the filters every 6 months, you'll be good." And then she said, "Well, can I thank you? And then I'll send you $40." And I was like, "No, I give advice for free, and I don't really know how to get $40 in the door if I tried." So I thanked her, and she said, "Well, can I send you a contaminated water supply?" Well, that I'm interested in. I'm always interested in contaminated water because then you have a standard of what it is. But I said, "You have reverse osmosis. Where are you going to get it from?" "Oh, I'll take it from the sprinkler system." I said, "Say what?" "Oh, they replaced this, but your taps are outside in West Michigan going tick, 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 with the water going across, and there's no filter on that." "No, because of course it's a $5,000 unit to get even 2 or 3 gallons a minute, an hour out. Imagine trying to do a system that's 99% of your water use in agriculture or in lawn watering, which is what we do in West Michigan. It's too expensive. So we now have point sources of water that are hundreds, if not thousands of parts per trillion, spraying through the backyards." And so I said, "Do you have a vegetable garden?" She said, "No." I said, "Good. Don't eat the grass. You're okay." But it's a good thing to know that we shouldn't be using watering systems in this same well.
Well, that's amazing because we have here at our home, we're the second owners of this house. We've been here since '92, and they dropped a well to use for the sprinkler system. Fresh water comes from the city, but they dropped the well there, and it's rusty, and I have to put a separate tank with a rust delimiter so it doesn't get on the side of the house and makes those
Yeah, exactly.
things.
We have the same thing here, hard water.
Yeah, hard water, right? But I never thought of it in that same way. Was PFAS one of the key elements in the Flint water disaster?
It wasn't. That was all lead.
Okay.
But it was a criminal act. They changed the lead softening, the additive they added to the water. They just saved money and said, "No, people won't notice. We'll just turn it off." And it was not a scientist who made that discovery, nor even a water manager. The water managers knew better than to do that, but they just did it anyway. And that of course, the people who went to jail were not that guy. He fled down, went to Florida, I think. But it's somebody went to jail for that, and that's because people's lives were put in danger by this. The PFAS is much more insidious. Nobody knows it's there. It's really hard to measure, and when we do measure it, it's everywhere. So what's a little bit over a long time versus a lot right now? Well, obviously you want to avoid the lot right now, but drinking waters is one of and the limits we're getting are very low in the part per trillion of the measurements, because if you drink several cups of this a day, you'll find that it doesn't take much before it start having effects in the humans that you can see.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I know you have to run, and I just want to, again, thank you so much for being a guest. More importantly, for taking on this amazing task, the work that you did. A lot of scientists work for certain things and they turn the information over to their bosses and nobody really hears about it. But you did something that reached out to 1.2 million firefighters in this country, both career, volunteer, part paid, and their families.
And their communities too.
And the communities too. And there is no way to truly, truly thank you for what you've done for us. It's an honor really to have you join me again. And
well, thank you, Steve.
It's information.
Very nice to say that. I'd like to tell you and your listeners that the reason we do this is for the firefighter. I mean, thank you for your service, and that doesn't get said enough these days. So I always try to say that at the end of my talks, just remind myself why I'm doing this. It's not just for the textbooks, but there are people out there, and they're risking their lives for us. This is a small contribution. We hope it helps.
It will. There's no doubt about it. Dr. Peaslee, once again, thank you very much. I hope we'll be in touch sometime in the next year and hear the continuation of your PFAS story.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be more papers. I'm not invited to many parties twice, so it's kind of fun to get invited back. So
That's great. Again, thank you
don't
very
eat the
much.
popcorn. Yeah,
Especially if it has that fake butter on it.
yeah, that's it.
But thank you very much. Stay safe and stay well, and much continued success in all your.
Thank you, Steve. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Stay safe. Bye-bye.